All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Before we get started, I am just going to go over some community agreements, if I can get that pulled up. All right, so these are just some things that we would like to just agree with in this space. The first one is one person, one mic. One person speaks at one time and don't interrupt. The facilitators in this meeting will be asked some questions specifically to our panelists. Please do not interrupt our panelists or use progressive stack until those questions are posed to the group. Progressive stack is when our facilitators will keep a list of names who type stack in the chat. In progressive stack, facilitators aim to give people from marginalized groups a chance to speak first in the conversation, as well as people who haven't spoken up. And then step up and step back. So if you've already contributed significantly to the conversation, consider taking a step back and letting others participate before you speak again. A good rule of thumb is wait 3, then me, before trying to hop on the stack again. If you haven't spoken up yet, please do. We would love to hear from you. Also, while in the discussion, please ask yourself, why am I talking? Or wait, consider whether or not what you want to say has already been said, or if it's on the topic, or if there's a better time or place to say it. And then also, when speaking, please use I statements, speak from your perspective and experiences, and avoid speaking from the perspective of others. All right, so I'll just go over what we're going to talk about today. So during today's discussion on Palestinian liberation, DSA members will be facilitating a panel discussion on the text Palestine, a Socialist Introduction, with the contributor Jehad Abusalim and editor Brian Bean, along with special guests Professor John Dabeet and activist Lawrence Maushard. The history of Palestine, the ethnic cleansing, genocide, and apartheid in the region have a long, detailed history that we cannot possibly discuss in just 2 hours. However, the text we are discussing here today does an excellent job of detailing the atrocities that have led to the recent events. If you have not been able to do the reading for today's event, we do encourage you to dive in if you can. The ebook is still free through Haymarket. So first, we are going to hear from Jehad and Brian. Their discussion will be followed by a short Q&A with questions from our audience, and that will be the first opportunity to do the progressive stack. And then following will be a broader panel, including all of our panelists today. And so our facilitator, Stephen, will ask the questions directly to our panelists, and Crystal will indicate when the discussion will be open for questions from our audience. Once again, just remember to use the stack, and that's just typing stack in the chat function, but just making sure that we wait until it's the Q&A time. Also, to our panelists, and just so everyone knows, we are going to try to get through as many questions as possible during our Q&A. So we are trying to limit the responses to the questions just for 3 minutes. So I will hold up a yellow card, and when we have 30 seconds left for that question, and then a red card when the time is up. So before we begin, I would like to just share with you the DSA statement. The Democratic Socialists of America unequivocally condemns the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and Sheikh Jarrah, the ongoing racist violence by Israeli police and Jewish settlers, as well as Israel's latest bombardment of Gaza. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle against apartheid, colonialism, and military occupation for equality, justice, and self-determination. The United States provides Israel with $3.8 billion of military aid annually and gives Israel special diplomatic cover for its countless violations of international law and Palestinian human rights. In line with the Palestinian call for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, DSA continues to call on elected officials, especially those endorsed by DSA, to support the Palestinian call to defund ethnic cleansing and fully boycott apartheid. More specifically, we demand not only an end to the ethnic cleansing of the historic Palestine, including Sheikh Jarrah, but the full recognition of the Palestinian people's basic rights as laid out by the 3 demands of the BDS movement, which are 1, the end of Israel's illegal occupation and ongoing colonialization. 2, equal rights for all Palestinians. And 3, the right of return for all Palestinian refugees to their homes as stipulated in the UN Resolution 194. These injustices have been the daily part of every Palestinian's life from the day that they were born, but the fiery resistance of the people remains unyielding. DSA unapologetically stands in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their ongoing struggle for liberation, from Sheikh Jahar to Gaza and beyond. And just before I hand it over to Stephen to introduce Brian and Jehad, I have a short recording that we wanted to share with you from the local family whose grandparents were refugees from Palestine. We hope that this video shows how close to home the ethnic genocide in Palestine really is. So give me just 1 second to pull that up.
Hi everyone, I'm Noor Al-Sakri.
And I'm Salma Al-Sakri.
And we are sisters. We're both Palestinian, and we just wanted to say that we're sorry we couldn't make it to the discussion and the panel, but we wanted to share a story about our grandparents who are Palestinian. So, starting off with my grandma, she was actually born in Palestine. She was very young when everything was going on, when the Zionists came and took over. But more about my family, they had a farm, lots of different fruits, and many farms around Palestine, and they're her brothers and sisters. It was just really nice, and her community, the neighborhood. And it all changed in 1948 when they were forced out of their homes, kicked out. They weren't able to take anything with them. They were forced. It was just a nightmare, you know?
So they became refugees because they were forced out of their homes and their homes were taken over. They became refugees and they eventually moved to Jordan. So a lot of our family currently lives in Amman, which is the capital of Jordan. And they are unable to go back to their homes because they are actually all demolished. All the farms that my grandparents grew up on and where they were born, they're all gone, either gone or they have been occupied. There's currently Israeli settlers living there right now. So there's no way that they can go back to their homes. They're not allowed. Even if they tried, they'd be told they're not allowed to. And yeah.
And a little bit more, a lot of our family from there, and it's sad that the fact that we're not able to go over there and are able to see our area where my grandparents grew up, which is Jaffa, and it's a little city in Palestine that was taken over and is now in the Israeli area where it's occupied and it's taken over. My grandparents' farm is gone. It's not there, and it's just sad to see that our farms and everything that we were so much told about
our grandparents gave us so many stories and told us a lot about how they grew up, and we're saddened that we can't see that for ourselves because of what's going on. And that's why it's so important that we must raise awareness about what's going on. And it's important for us because we have to spread these stories and share what our grandparents have told us. This generation has to explain, and we can't let the word die down. Like, we can't let the Zionists, we can't let the Israelis continue with their propaganda. We can't let that happen. We have to share our stories, and we have to speak up about what is going on, because if we don't, then they will take over like they have been. But we won't back down. And we know that the Palestinians in Palestine right now, and in Gaza and every other city, they won't back down because they love their country that belongs to them. They love their land, and we want eventually to return and see what it was.
And in the end, this is not about, we don't want a one state or two state solution. This is Palestine. It is it will be always be
Yeah,
Palestine.
it'll always be Palestine.
You know, we don't want any hate towards the Israelis. We are against the people who are the bad people,
Yeah,
the Zionists, the
that
people
want
who
their
are
own.
ethnic cleansing, who are demolishing the homes of the innocent people, who are forcing them out of their homes, who are making them demolish their own homes and giving them fines or killing them if they don't listen to the rules. If they don't follow the rules, they get jailed for no reason. They get shot out just for walking into their homes. People go, and Zionists they walk into their homes and make it seem like it's their own home when it's not. This is a Palestinian family's home. People like me and my sister, our ages, they're getting arrested. They're getting shot at the streets. They're getting told that they can't go to school anymore. They're scared to go to school. This is their life, you know? Little kids are not able to even go to their schools because they're demolished. They're taken down. They're bombed. They're just all gone. And it's just a sad reality, and it's something that we don't want. We don't want this to be the reality of Palestinians. We don't want this to be the reality of anyone. We don't want this to be the reality.
And it has been the reality for the past, how many years?
For the past 73 years.
Yes, exactly.
Since the Nakba, and it's always been the Nakba, and it's just really, it's time to stop. It's time to end the ethnic cleansing. It's time to end the apartheid. It's all, like, we just need to stop. This is killing innocent people. Is not right. Palestinians, they don't have an army. They don't even have an army to defend themselves. Their army is them. They are their army. They're the ones. Their weapons are rocks. They're strong. Our people are strong.
Yes, and it's so unequal, the amount of power that the Israeli military has compared to the Palestinians. The Israeli military is funded by the US. It's funded, our tax money and all that. You can do your research, but all of that is funded and it's given to the Israeli military and to Israel. And all of that is built up, and it literally funds all the high-tech military equipment, everything, just to take over, like, all the Palestinian land, all the arrests, everything. Like, you look at videos with the Israeli military with huge, like, guns and everything while they're standing in front of a little boy with a rock, or a family that doesn't have anything with them. Like, it's unequal. It's not, this is not a war. This is literally this is a ethnic cleansing. It's not a war. This isn't equal on both sides.
Yeah. And just to wrap it up, guys, we just wanted to share what we've been learning and what we've been hearing from our parents and from our relatives that are around that area. And we just wanted to share our story because it's never gonna die. Our grandparents' story will be passed on and on. It will be passed on to my kids. It will be going on and on until Palestine is free, and it will be free.
Palestine will be free forever and always.
Yes, and just
that's
make
what
sure
we are fighting for.
Right, and just make sure you guys do your research, and thank you guys for listening.
Yes.
That was really beautiful, and I feel very lucky that we were able to connect with Noor and Salma, despite the distance and different internet or technological issues. One thing I just wanted to highlight there that was so powerful for me personally was just like the way in which memory and passing on and generating and creating historical memory is so important when history exists to erase, right? Like the existence of Palestinians there. And so that was just very moving for me to hear Noor and Salma talk about, you know, their connection to their grandparents and to those stories and to their lives. So, but I do want to introduce our contributors or a couple contributors from the book, Palestine: A Socialist Introduction. And I'm going to introduce Brian Bean, who is an editor on it and a contributor, as well as Jehad Abusalim, who is a contributor on the book. So first I'm going to introduce Brian and then Jehad. Brian Bean is a Chicago-based socialist activist writer, and speaker originally from North Carolina. He is one of the founding editors of Rampant Magazine. His work has been published in Jacobin, Socialist Worker, Red Flag, International Viewpoint, Bel Akmar, Spring Magazine, Green Left Weekly, Chronique de Palestine, Agency, Viento Sur, and more. Jehad Abusalim is one of the contributors to our text and the author of the essay Palestine in Tahrir. Abusalim is also the Education and Policy Associate of the Palestine Activism Program at the American Friends Service Committee. He is completing his PhD in the History and Hebrew and Judaic Studies Joint Program at New York University. His main area of research is Palestinian and Arab perceptions of the Zionist project and the Jewish question before 1948. He's an accomplished speaker and writer. Jehad combines his passion for history with his commitment to activism and policy change work. Jehad's family continues to live in Gaza, and we're very lucky to have them here with us today. So please, let's give it up for Brian and Jehad.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks everyone for having us. Midwest represent. It's always fun to speak in the region because Zoom means you're kind of all over the place. 10 minutes is a small amount of time to introduce a topic such as this. So I'm going to start kind of with some current events, because I think that's kind of the reason that we're all here to begin with. It's the reason why people all over the country and all over the world are talking about Palestine more so than usual. And that's an important thing. And I think it's important for us to continue to talk about Palestine and keep talking about Palestine, even though the immediacy of the Israeli bombs on Gaza have temporarily stopped. So the two events that I think stand out are the bombing of Gaza that was carried on for 11 days that ended about 3 weeks ago. During that, the Zionist entity murdered 248 people, 66 of them children. Around 1,300 homes were destroyed, and about 68 schools or medical facilities. And as the young women in the video stated, this is on an area that is the most densely populated region in the world. It's been under near total blockade by Israel and by Egypt since 2007, and it does not have a conventional military. And so this practice of the Zionist entity of laying waste to sections of Gaza is also something that isn't really that unusual. Every couple years, they do the same thing in a phrase that is grotesquely been described by Israeli officials as mowing the grass, as sort of tending to try to sort of reduce the offensive potential of Hamas and just to collectively punish the Palestinians living in Gaza. And so, those events also occurred at the exact same time as there were massive protests to defend the forcible expulsion of families from the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. And so the important thing about that is that, similar to what we talked about with Gaza, the practice of forcibly evicting, dispossessing Palestinian families is also something that isn't unusual. The ethnic cleansing is everyday occurrence. And while there's families in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, there's other neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, Silwan, that also faces forcible disposition by the Israeli state and by settler organizations. The Israeli state is talking about the complete annexation of the West Bank. Illegal settlements continue to be built in the West Bank. There's a 350 building new settlement that is being constructed just outside of Ramallah in the West Bank. And home demolitions are a regular occurrence. In 2020, 638 Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem were demolished to make way for Jewish Zionist settlers to be sort of put in there. In the Negev, a different sort of region, just last month, there was a village named Arakib that was bulldozed. This same village has been destroyed 184 times and continued to be sort of rebuilt. So this ongoing project of forcible disposition, of ethnic cleansing, is the mission statement, if you will, of the Zionist entity of the Israeli state. It is its stated mission since its inception. And its inception, of course, is in the events that we describe as the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe. And so those events in 1948 meant that there was the planned ethnic cleansing of Palestinians to carry out the practice of settler colonialism. And so by settler colonialism, we mean that is an outside grouping of people who come in with the goal to remove the people who originally sort of lived there and to take their place. So it's different than sort of a colonialism where a foreign power, a colonial power attempts to just exert control. It's one in which people are removed. And of course, that removal created the largest refugee population that currently exists. 1 million people who were forced off of their land by Zionist militias from 48 to 49. And as of now, based on some numbers, the number of Palestinian refugees in the diaspora is about 6 million people. And so in this process, and I think again to sort of speak to, I think that the young woman in the video said it quite well when she said, since the Nakba, it has always been the Nakba. And so this process of ethnic cleansing, of settler colonialism, is one that was how the Israeli state was instituted, and it's practice daily, every day, from the West Bank to East Jerusalem to the so-called Judaization of Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are continually look to see their citizenship rights stripped, to see their rights sort of taken away, and unequal citizens inside the Israeli state. And then, of course, there's Gaza, which is the human rights disaster that I described, and has been under the blockade by Israel since 2007. And so these are the events that I think that people are talking about because of the tremendous protests around Sheikh Jarrah, youths leading demonstrations, refusing to back down, and whatnot. And so I think that what this ties to is what we talk about in the book, which is the need to have a socialist perspective on the question of Palestine. And there's two features of that. One is that if we're really going to be serious about how we're going to have justice for Palestinians, that in the region, there has to be a challenge of capitalism. There has to be a challenge of capitalism in the region. Similarly, the flip side of what we talk about the socialist perspective is that socialists in the United States have to see fighting for justice in Palestine as a central task. And so these are the two twin poles when we talk about the socialist perspective on Palestine. Justice requires a challenge to capitalism regionally, and socialists in the United States have to see Palestine as a central task. And so I want to sort of take up on these two kind of poles of the socialist perspective quite briefly, but hopefully it can set up some conversation. So when we talk about why we require a challenge to capitalism regionally, I think that is looking at the fact that the Zionist project, since before it instituted itself as a so-called state, required imperial backing. And so even during the first waves of settlement that was going on, the Zionist movement reached out to the German Kaiser, the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Tsar, all types of folks, because they know that if they wanted to, forcibly dispossess a people and take it over and create an ethno-state, which is the goal of Zionism, they would need some powerful ally. And that ally has shifted through time. After World War II, the primary ally of the Zionist project was the British. And then in the late 60s, the United States became the primary ally of the Zionist project. And that relationship has been a stalwart, steadfast one since that time. JFK, the Democratic president, coined the term the special relationship. And this special relationship has meant that the US backs the Zionist entity and all its human rights egregiousness since that time. And they do that with a nice price tag. They routinely give more foreign military spending to Israel than any other country in the world by far, 3.8 billion sort of per year. And a memorandum of understanding was signed by the Trump administration that Biden is going to continue, that will maintain that funding for the next 10 years. And that's just the initial funding. On top of that, there's other weapon sales. There was a weapon sale that went in right before the events around Sheikh Jarrah at the beginning of the month, at the beginning of May, for $738 million. And after Israel depleted its ammunition by killing Palestinians in Gaza, they have come back to the United States and said, we want another $1 billion to fill up these sorts of things. And so the sheer monetary backing of the racist machine that sort of carries us out is one that the United States sort of carries out. I think on top of that, there's also the political backing, and that is in some ways as important. The UN routinely will try to make statements calling out this or that offense that the Israeli state has carried out, and the United States routinely blocks it at every instance. Also, the way in which the so-called peace process has been carried out during Oslo and afterwards, the goal of that has been to secure an economic zone in the region that is under U.S. hegemony. And so that process has meant that also that the various Arab states surrounding the occupied territories have more and more found their economies and their political structures to be integrated with Israel. So the United States has also ushered in a peace process that has normalized relationships with the Arab states, and that has only politically isolated the Palestinian resistance more so. And on top of that, one of Biden's first acts that he carried out when he came into office was to deny the legitimacy of the International Criminal Court's attempt to investigate Israeli apartheid. And so the sheer amount of military funding, of political support that comes to the United States is part of the reason why, if we want to think about how we're going to tackle Israel's presence in the region and find justice for Palestinians, we have to take up those interests. And the interests of the United States, I think this is just important to name, and I'll begin to sort of wrap up on this, is that the Middle East is still strategically a very important location. Capitalism's favorite fuel is oil, and still a majority of oil comes from that region. And it's also important to note that the desire to maintain a certain degree of hegemonic control over oil by the United States isn't for just domestic consumption. The US produces a lot of oil now, but a lot of the oil goes to China, and the US, of course, is competing with China, and Biden is banging the wars of drum even more so in that regard. So controlling that, it's an important shipping hub, is geopolitical significance, and so all this has meant that maintaining a aircraft carrier, as Netanyahu referred to the state of Israel, in the region is really important for the United States. And so that's why, if we think about how we're going to actually sort of unhook this overwhelming support of the Zionist project, that we have to talk about what motivates and what drives the investment in Zionism by the United States and by the other capitalist powers as well. And that means that we have to sort of see that as breaking. Last thing, and I think this is a simple sort of equation, but why socialists here have to see Palestine as essential. And I think that is a very simple situation. If we want to talk about democracy in our country, if we want to talk about being able to spend our resources on the things we need, like Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, we have to talk about how much defense spending goes out. And even though the majority of it doesn't go to Israel, the sort of steadfast support of the Israeli project is one that is a central pillar in foreign policy. And so if we're going to talk about defense spending, we're going to wind up talking about Israel. And lastly, I think that we also have a special responsibility, if you will, to stand on the side of the Palestinian people. If the US ruling class has a special relationship with Israel and backs it, then we, as people who want to stand on the side of the oppressed all around the world, have to have a special responsibility for us to fight our government's continual backing of the most racist, violent state perhaps on the face of the planet. And so I'll wrap there. Hopefully that kind of jars some conversation. I'll turn it over to Jehad, who I'm sure will fix everything that I left out.
Thank you, Brian. There's one problem here, is that you summed up the whole Palestine question in 10 minutes, and you did it skillfully in ways that are really, really brilliant. Thank you so much. And again, I'm really thankful for our friends at the DSA for inviting me and for organizing this great event. And it's always a pleasure to have these conversations and to talk about Palestine and to hear from people. And I hope there is a chance for us to hear from people in the audience, answer their questions, and hear about what kind of activism and engagement they have been part of in order to advocate for Palestinian rights and for peace and justice in Palestine. So, just to add to what Brian said earlier, and the Palestinian question is not a political, moral question that is in isolation. From the moment of its inception, from the first moment Zionist settlers stepped foot in Palestine, and up until today, the international community has been involved in one way or another in facilitating this settler colonial project that has been violent and that has been deadly for Palestinians. And because of this fact of history and fact of life today, it's imperative on members of societies, citizens of countries that played a role in facilitating the Zionist endeavor and project in Palestine to assume this responsibility, this special responsibility that Brian has talked about. So it's a moral position to take, yes, but also it's a historic responsibility towards millions of Palestinians who are paying the price, a heavy price from their blood, from their being away from home, from their expulsion, and have been prevented from self-determination and from getting their basic rights. So I always like to begin with this piece because it's really important. The leaders of the Zionist movement, as Brian mentioned, from the very beginning of the articulation of the Zionist idea as a path to solve the quote-unquote European Jewish question or Jewish question in Europe, they realized that in order to achieve their goals, they have to ally with Western imperialism. They have to ally with countries and with entities that had colonial ambitions in the Middle East in general, and in Palestine and the surrounding Arab countries in particular. And the one important thing we need to understand about the political Zionist leaderships, the early ones and the later ones, is that they were all citizens of Western countries. In Western societies, they were European and American. They did not believe in a program for Jewish emancipation in the respective communities and societies where Jewish people lived. They had a cynical attitude towards the idea and goal of working for a better world, and they substituted a struggle for against capitalism and against racism and against xenophobia and against anti-Semitism in these local contexts where they existed. They altered that by a vision to create a settler colonial society in Palestine and surrounded by walls and arms and isolate themselves from the need to engage and struggle and fight for a better world. And this, in essence, summarizes the early stages of the Zionist project, especially in its relationship to the European or Western world context where it first started to operate. And I say that because the Palestinian struggle, as I mentioned earlier, is not just limited to the Palestinian geography. It's an international issue. And when Zionists decided that they're going to advocate for Jewish immigration to Palestine, based on an alliance with imperialist powers, and so on and so forth. They did so at the expense of other Jewish people who lived in Eastern Europe, who lived in Western Europe, and in the United States, who had a different vision than the vision Zionism had for advocating against anti-Semitism, for building a better world for Jews, in not only, you know, in a settler colony in Palestine, but to imagine their future as equal citizens of their respective societies in the West, in America, in Europe, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about Palestine, we have to think about it as an international issue, and a struggle also within the Arab region, within the Middle East, and also a struggle for Palestinian rights and equality, and for, you know, justice in Palestine as well. So and Palestinians realized that from the early moment, right? Like when Palestinians saw Zionist settlers coming to Palestine, the early intellectuals and thinkers and activists who clashed with the Zionist project and who resisted the Zionist project, they understood that that Palestinians alone, they can't fight this enterprise because of its connections to these Western countries that supported them and uplifted them. And I will mention the example of one Palestinian intellectual and activist who I actually study his story, his life journey as part of my academic work. His name was Muhammad Najati Qudsi, and he was Muhammad Najati Sidqi. He was a leftist activist born and raised in Jerusalem. In the 1920s, he traveled to Moscow, where he went to college, and he you know, joined in different leftist groups, and he became involved in the leftist politics of the early 20th century. He came to Palestine and he helped Arabize the Palestine Communist Party before the party split over questions of Zionism and nationalism and so on and so forth. And later on, Muhammad Najati Sidqi leaves Palestine to fight against fascism in Spain. Although he left Palestine during a time when his effort was needed there, but people like him realized and understood that the fight against fascism is an internationalist fight. So even though he was needed in Palestine, he still answered the call of his Spanish comrades. He traveled to Spain and he helped produce anti-Franco propaganda that that supported the fight against fascism in Spain. And then he returned to Palestine, and after 1948 he would become a refugee. And before that, during World War II, he worked on publishing against the Nazis and warned against the danger of Nazi ideology and so on and so forth. And while at the same time resisting the Zionist project and calling for a free and equal and socialist Palestine. So here is an example of a Palestinian whose life was not limited by borders, and whose fight for justice, and whose fight for fight against fascism, and whose struggle for a better world was not limited by nationality or ethnicity or faith. And I think there are a lot of stories like this in Palestine and other contexts. When we people like Malcolm X visited Gaza in the 1960s. And he came to Gaza and he was welcomed by Gaza's chief judge, and he toured Gaza, toured the refugee camps, and met with people. And people who wrote about Malcolm X's visit to Gaza wrote that he cried on his way out, and as he was taking the steps up to his plane, he waved to the Gaza delegation that welcomed him, and with tears he said, "We shall return, we shall return." Unfortunately, he would be assassinated months later, but in his understanding of the Palestinian cause was rooted also in an understanding that justice and injustice are all connected, and the struggle for justice and also the systems of injustice are all connected and need to be resisted as well. So there's so much to cover and there's so much to talk about. And I know I was asked to talk about my contribution in the book. My contribution for the book revolves around this notion. Although I focus mostly on support for Palestine within the context of the Arab Spring, the message of my chapter is that the struggle for Palestine is strongly linked to the struggle for a better world in the region, in the vicinity of Palestine, in the Arab world, but also in a place like the United States, but also, for the global struggle against fascism and against also colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. So I really think today, when we talk about Palestine, we need not to imagine Palestine as this isolated place where we think of the people there as charity cases or victims who we owe some occasional sympathy when the bombs fall, but to think of Palestine as an extension of a world that we all belong to, and a world that we see a better place, and a world that we work together, when we struggle here for equality, for racial justice, for all sorts of human rights in the US, we're also helping Palestinians because we're trying to push this place to be a better place and to cease to contribute negatively on an international stage. And Palestine is just one example of the role the US has played a negative role in and can play a very positive role in once people like you can work for a better vision for how this role can be played. So I will stop here. Thanks for listening and thanks for the invitation. And please, I would love to hear from the audience if possible. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jehad and Brian, for joining us today and sharing all that wonderful information. We are, in fact, going to open up our chat now. If anyone in the audience has questions specifically for Jehad or Brian based on what they just spoke to us about, please go ahead now and type stack into the chat, and I will call on you to ask your question. I see Nicholas has a question. Nicholas, do you want me to read your question or would you like to ask it?
I can ask it. So in a Socialist Introduction to Palestine in Chapter 7, they talk about boycott, divestment, and sanction. What do you think the critical pressure points needed in our current moment are, and how do we build power to put pressure on to achieve that boycott, divestment, and sanction?
Brian or Jehad, either one of you want to jump in and answer that one?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so I think what is needed to put pressure on BDS now is, in my opinion, kind of given some more wind in the sails of the movement. I think that there was a flourishing of BDS campaigns, specifically on college campuses, during the Obama years. And I think that is one of the things that has brought about the sort of sea change about consciousness around Palestine. I think more and more, if you're someone who sees yourself as a progressive or a socialist, then you stand on the side of Palestine. I think that's because of the success of the BDS campaign on college campuses. I think there's been a lull in BDS. And so I think now is the opportunity to restart it. And so I think that as far as pressure points, I think one important area that has been very weak in this country is in the trade union movement. And so BDS outside the United States, trade unions are powerful backers of it. National trade union federations in the UK, in France, in Scandinavia, like multi-million member farmers unions in India back BDS. In the United States, it's actually quite measly. Why that has to do with just the political weakness of the labor movement here, 40 years of defeats, a tie to the Democratic Party. But I think the short answer is figure out where to do a BDS campaign is the first bit of it. And I think bring it into labor as much as possible. As the bombs were falling on Gaza in the US, the first teachers union passed a BDS resolution in San Francisco. I think stuff like that. So bring in a trade union locals back in BDS, but then putting teeth on it, not just being a statement in favor of BDS, but actually trying to sort of fight for that disinvestment. So that's my main piece. I think also talking about sanctions a little more, but I'll see if Jehad wants to talk about that.
Yeah, so the BDS work in the US has a twofold focus, and one is on the offensive and another is on the defensive. BDS is on the defensive because there have been a lot of attempts to criminalize BDS, especially on a local, state level, and sometimes city level, legislation. There have been attempts to codify anti-BDS legislation into law, and those tactics are very dangerous because they set precedents and because they encroach on people's right for freedom of speech, and they are just unacceptable. So there have been many attempts to link state aid in times of catastrophe to people signing on affidavits or paperwork that in which they testify that they won't have any links to the BDS movement. So it's important for people amongst you who are involved in any kind of local work to pay attention to these attempts to pass such legislations or codify into law anti-BDS criminalization. And Brian talked about the offensive aspect of the BDS movement, the fact that there is, although the movement has been in a law, there is a renewed interest by a new generation of students, of activists, in taking on companies like Boeing, for example. Boeing is heavily involved in manufacturing arms that are thrown on the heads of our families in Gaza. So, hopefully soon we will see campaigns that will call upon retirement funds and universities and all sorts of businesses to divest from these companies, and hopefully we will get to the S part of the BDS, right? Like the sanction part at some point. I really call upon people to visit the Investigate website, which is a campaign by the American Friends Service Committee. I will share the website here on the chat. And it's a campaign that helps people identify which companies and corporations are complicit in human rights violations by just visiting the website and typing the name of the company in the search box. So you can, if your uncle is invested in the stock market, if you are invested in the stock market, you can tell which company is actually involved in human rights violations, not only in Palestine, but also in anti-immigration efforts in the US and in the prison industrial complex in the United States too. So please visit Investigate. You can identify which companies are involved in all sorts of these brutal human rights violations.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. We are going to take one more question before we bring in our other two panelists. Chris Haynes, you are up next on stack. If you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Awesome, thank you. I'm primarily directing my question to Jehad here. For someone like myself, who's primarily a practicing Catholic, to your knowledge, do you know by chance, like through your research, what the official position of the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church has been to the situation in Palestine from Nakba onward?
Thank you. I mean, I will speak based on my personal experience, and it's something that a lot of people are surprised with when I say it. I went to Gaza's Catholic school, which is led by a priest called Manuel Musallam, who is one of the most honorable and one of the most inspiring Palestinian faith leaders. He used to head the Catholic community in Gaza. A Palestinian the Palestinian churches have been not only part of the struggle, they led the struggle for Palestinian against, the injustice that befell the Palestinian people. And when it comes to Palestinians, Israeli rockets do not distinguish between a Muslim and a Christian. And there's so much that can be said about that. But I personally, I can't refer you now to the official positions of the different churches, but I can definitely share resources with you. Just give me your contact information. And I also would like for you to visit the Churches for Middle East Peace website and other faith-based organizations that do that kind of work in Palestine. And there are a lot of churches in the US, and there have been a lot of calls by either churches or Palestinian Christian faith leaders to call upon the their faith communities in the United States to take action and resist the occupation. I'm sure there are a lot of resources. If you're interested in detailed lists or resources, I'm more than happy to share them with you.
Thank you so much. Now we are going to bring on two other panelists. We have Professor John Dabeet with us, who is from the Midwest here, as well as an activist here from Central Illinois, Lawrence Maushard. They're each going to take a few minutes to talk about the work that they have been doing over the last several years and their role within the movement. And then we are going to have Stephen facilitating the broader panel discussion. So John, if you would like to jump in and go first. Lawrence, you can follow right after.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you, the what I call the Bloomington Democrats Socialists of America for the invites and for this great event. As I was sitting and listening to Jehad and Brian, and before that to Noor and Salma's video, I couldn't help it but to say I'm extremely proud of everything that I'm hearing. Just to give you a background about who I am a Palestinian American. I was born in Jerusalem, and as a matter of fact, unfortunately for the past 30 years, I wasn't allowed to visit Jerusalem, even though I was born in Jerusalem. I grew up in Ramallah. I finished my school from the Catholic school in Ramallah. Then I finished my bachelor degree from Bethlehem University in Bethlehem, Palestine, and then moved to Pennsylvania, East Coast, work on my MBA in economics, and then accepted the job here in the Midwest in Iowa. And while I start working and teaching at the college here in Iowa, I work on my PhD in economics also at the University of Iowa. But just being a Palestinian, obviously, we always say that we can leave Palestine, but Palestine always stay in our heart. It doesn't matter where we live. I do believe that each one of us has to be an ambassador for Palestine and do whatever he or she can do in order to further the issue of Palestine on the international arena. One of the things that I would like to say here in particular, I am the vice president of the U.S. Palestinian Council, which is a nationwide organization, and we have been extremely busy working heavily here in the United States, basically lobbying Congress members, State Department, even the White House. I do believe that we need to get involved in order to make it a change. Yes, sometimes it might be very difficult to create that change, but we should not basically give up that kind of involvement no matter what. As I'm thinking with what Noor and Salma mentioned in that brief video, at some point in time, they said the old will die and the young will forget. But guess what? We tell them that no matter what, the old will continue to carry that flag. And when it's time for them to go, they give it to the young to continue that road, and that road to the liberation of Palestine, because that is very important. I was really, if I may say one more thing here, and I rather get engaged with question answer thing, but if I may just add one more thing. I do, as a Palestinian American, I do feel empowered of what I have been seeing in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Gaza, in Ramallah, in Bethlehem, in Haifa, in Jenin, in Lod, in Jaffa, in all over Europe, in United States, the street of United States, whether big cities and small cities. A couple weeks ago, in one day, we had over 62 demonstrations all over United States in one day. So we never seen that before. I think this is now what I would call a new movement that started with the last problems that started in Sheikh Jarrah and Jerusalem into Gaza. And I think all of us are determined to continue that, until liberation. So this time is different than any other time before. Thank you again for inviting me, and I rather answer questions if that would be the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lawrence, go ahead and jump in and introduce yourself and your connection to the liberation of Palestine.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to say thank you to the Bloomington DSA. You folks are hosting this. You got all the energy and efforts together here to bring a wonderful group of people together. I'm very proud and honored to be here with Professor Dabeet and everyone else. And I just want to say thank you to the Bloomington DSA for sponsoring this. I'm a writer and a journalist based in Peoria, right in the middle of central Illinois. And most important thing I've been able to accomplish recently, on May 23rd, right after the horrific bombardment of Gaza, we were able to coalesce the human rights community here in conjunction with the Palestinian Americans in central Illinois, and have the largest rally for Palestine and BDS Caterpillar. We had a rally and march in Peoria on the 23rd that was the largest of its kind ever in this area. We're very, very proud of that, and we're trying to capitalize on the movement here. It was so successful. We had some of the cops that were there that were very hands-off, thank God. They estimated the crowd about 400 people. We started at the main intersection of Main and University in Peoria, and we marched down Main Street about a half a mile to Main and Sheridan. If anyone knows that in Peoria, it's a major intersection. We peacefully took over the intersection and had our main speakers for the rally, give their presentations in the middle of the intersection at Main and Sheridan in Peoria for about an hour. And this is on Sunday in the middle of the afternoon, and it was one of the most heartening things I've ever seen in any type of activist actions here in central Illinois or anywhere else. And it was successful because of the Palestinian community turned out, and we provided a space for them to feel safe from some of the craziness that they've seen recently in the larger cities like New York and Chicago and such. There was a lot of fights on the street, but nothing like that happened here. It was peaceful, it was calm, it was informational, and it was heartening to the people here who are part of the human rights community and part of the the Palestine solidarity community. So we were able to do that on May 23rd here in Peoria, and that was a really a follow-up to a much smaller action that we had 3 years ago in July 2018, right after all of the horrific 70th anniversary Nakba actions in occupied Palestine, which included the illegal transfer of the embassy from Tel Aviv to occupied Jerusalem. And I was there for that. I was there on the ground for those actions in April and May of 2018. I was so horrified by what we saw and experience, we saw on mainstream the newscasts of the Israelis, military snipers murdering, shooting down peaceful, unarmed protesters, Palestinians, in the Great Return March. And that so horrified me. I couldn't believe I was seeing this on the news. And I went there. I just got on a plane and I went and tried to enter Gaza. I was turned back by the Egyptian military, but ended up overland into Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem. I did not try to go through Tel Aviv airport. I will never go through the David Ben Gurion airport. That's just ridiculous. So I went overland from Amman, Jordan, through the King Hussein Bridge there, just taking buses like everyone else does in the region, and was able to get past the Israeli border police there. It was just, that was an interesting thing too, because when they interviewed me, you know, I just played down my politics. And I just said, I'm a traveling, you know, I'm a Christian. I want to see the whole Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And they tried to tell, what is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? And you could see this lieutenant, this high officer who interviewed me, you could see the murder in his eyes. You could see the fact that he had been responsible, personally responsible for just the horrors that you see that happen on a daily basis, and have happened on a daily basis and for decades for the Palestinians there. And I saw that from the moment that I entered occupied Palestine until the moment that I left there. And when I did leave, I'm from Peoria, okay? So the great connection there between Peoria and Palestine is Caterpillar Incorporated, which is the infamous face of the home demolitions, the illegal home demolitions by the occupation forces on the Palestinian people. Those are Caterpillar, primarily, not exclusively, of course, but primarily they've been Caterpillar weaponized bulldozers, D9s, D10s, other heavy equipment, okay? And I'm from Peoria. And so, you know, I have to almost live with this shame that the main employer, one of the main employers in the area, the traditional home of Caterpillar, is the #1 manufacturing BDS international target, okay? Caterpillar has been involved with supplying their equipment for profit to the Israeli military for decades, not years, decades. And to be, you know, my family, my friends, people I know, grew up with, they're part of Caterpillar. And so the occupation is not far away. It's right here in central Illinois. And that's very important that we, you know, that we use the leverage that we have, the people who are born and raised here in central Illinois, in middle America. You know, there is no separation between us and occupied Palestine. We're part of it. You know, not only do our taxes pay the money for, you know, the U.S. enabling of the occupation, but our direct paychecks, you know, come from these weapons that are used to demolish Palestinian homes and properties and agriculture and farms and businesses. And not only that, but Caterpillar is used their equipment for constructing illegal settlements. And so they are making blood money profits off the occupation, coming and going. And it's just like we need to very much take a stock of that as people here in America. You know, we need to take stock of, you know, do we want stock in places like Caterpillar? Do we want to be working for them? And we don't want to destroy these things like Caterpillar. We want them to change their policies. So that's what they need to see. And on May 23rd, it was just as much a BDS Caterpillar rally as it was a pro-Palestine rally. So these are the actions that we need to do to put pressure on the capitalist, you know, really monsters that are making blood money off oppression and have done so for years. It's up to us as activists. It's up to us our responsibility as people of the world, as human rights advocates. It's our responsibility. Not only, do we have to do this because, oh, it's happens to be popular now, but it's our responsibility. Otherwise, what are we doing here? One other thing, I've been involved with Palestine for decades before I was able to have the great honor to go there myself. I'm a writer, and my first job back in around 1985 down in Pana, Illinois, I interviewed a gentleman who was a journalist, and he was doing a backgrounder on a famous American journalist whose name was Vincent Sheehan, okay, Sheean. And he wrote a book called Personal History that was a bestseller of sorts. It was a memoir of his travels in 1935, Personal History, 1935. You can find it in any library. It's been out of print for years, but you can find it. And the last chapter in that book is called The Holy Land. And Sheehan was on the ground in Jerusalem and other parts of Palestine in August of 1929. Okay, this is very famous riots that happened in and around Jerusalem in 1929. And he was there and he reported on it. And the thing was that he rightly laid the blame for those riots, which killed hundreds of people on both sides, Jews and Palestinians, on the Zionists at the time who were trying to take possession of the Wailing Wall. At the time, it was an Arab property, and they were trying to buy. They tried to buy it outright, and they said no. And then they tried to set up shrines and make de facto temples there at the Wailing Wall. And what the Zionists at that time did, they provoked a conflict. They intentionally provoked a conflict. And from that time on, Vincent Sheehan and others saw what the Zionist movement was all about. This is way back in the 1920s. And if anyone does their research, they can see there's been a progression until now. And you saw those two young girls in that video. And the thing that pained me is like their lives and the lives of so many young Palestinians around the world, the diaspora, their lives are already, they're so damaged, because if they have any awareness in education, and they all do, of, being from an oppressed land. And their whole focus of their lives is taken up with this cause, this mission that most people in the world don't have to deal with. On top of everything else in modern life, you have to worry about an entity that is trying to erase your culture. And so even though they don't live there, they are experiencing the pain and the horrors that the people who do live there experience that here right in America. And I think that's a terrible thing, and we have to alleviate that. One other thing, our mission now is to stop the money to Israel, the US money. Once the money from the United States stops, the occupation will end. One of the gentlemen here mentioned that they've already put in, Israel has already put in a request for $1 billion to resupply their weapons stores, because they've used them all. I mean, they don't even have, these Zionists, they don't even have enough really intelligence to wait and ask for that, a weapons resupply, the voucher from the United States. It's like immediately, we have to resupply and get ready for the next massacre. I think what's happened is that the American people specifically, who are the paymasters for Tel Aviv, they've seen the horrors now. They've seen the innocent bloodshed, and that has changed the American public's perception of the whole equation. Most of the American public now is with Palestine. The Zionists know this. The people in Israel know this. Netanyahu, he's been defeated partly because of his overreach in Gaza. Everything is changing now. Some of the stuff that the people have been talking about right here today, it's already old news, because I think everything is changing in the American public opinion. And once you get the American public opinion on your side, you will not fail. And now that's happening for Palestine. America, I don't feel, will ever blindly support Israel any longer. That has peaked. And now we on the ground activists and others who are allies of Palestine have to make sure that the American aid to Israel stops now. And once that happens, the occupation will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, John, for those introductions to your experiences. And we're grateful to you all for joining us. So yeah, I'm trying to do that fun thing where you amalgamize everything that's just been said into a great question, and hopefully I come close. And but you know, I want to pick up on some of this, especially I want to combine kind of the uptick in struggle that folks have been talking about regarding Palestine and regarding like the increase in awareness, and more than awareness, just like political actions taken by U.S. activists and around the world. So I want to combine that with internationalism a little bit and ask about, so kind of crack open the bigger question of why is Palestine a global question? And especially vis-a-vis the recent history, the relationship between our moment here in the United States with ongoing indigenous struggles for self-determination, you know, with the pipelines in the Dakota Access, as well as Line 3 around Minnesota right now, as well as developing abolitionist, anti-racist rebellions from 2014, BLM, and then upsurging again last summer. I'm trying to ask, like, what connections do we see between our struggles here, as well as the Palestinian struggle and Black liberation, especially trying to communicate with a settler colonial people of our own, or a settler people. And I know that these are messy terms, but like we're dealing with a settler people of our own here in the United States. And maybe, so I guess the question is, why is there an uptick? What is the connection between BLM and especially maybe also the control of words like peace, violence, terrorism, and both sidesism? So I kind of, maybe that's a stew, but folks can jump in. I guess John wants to start off, yeah.
Yeah, if you allow me to answer, that's a great question, as a matter of fact. First of all, let's remember that the media in the United States is trying to frame the confrontation as if it's a confrontation between, let's say, Netanyahu and Hamas. We reject that notion 100%, because the confrontation, and the real one, is between Israel for the past, at least I would say 73 years, if it's not more, and the Palestinian people. And that started with what I call 67 words of imperialism, documentation, or declaration, which we call the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So that is the declaration that gave someone that doesn't even own the land the right to give that land to someone that didn't even live in that land. So those are very important, that when we approach the media in the United States, it is important also to tell what I call the story, the side of the Palestinian side of the story, because obviously the mainstream media, as my friend Lawrence here mentioned also, is concentrating more on the Israeli propaganda and the Zionist propaganda. So that is very important thing. Now let's remember that Netanyahu lived on something called incitement. He continued to incite against Palestinians, and even the Palestinians that lives within the 1948. And we see that those Palestinians are in the streets now demonstrating against the Israeli government too, practices and so on. I always tell people, you don't need to be Palestinian to stand up for Palestine. You only need to be human. And that is very important thing. So I think Stephen, to answer your question, For example, when I go and talk to people, I usually use stories. I believe in the power of stories. When I tell them that because I was elected to lead the student senate or student government at Bethlehem University, I was imprisoned by the Israeli and I was tortured for many, many times during my years at Bethlehem University. So basically put that in perspective here in the United States and tell that story is that, okay, well, can you imagine being a student at this college or that university, and you want to be active and you want to participate in student activities, and as a result of that, you are in prison and you are tortured because you are doing that. So traditionally, as I said, and I travel all over the United States, but I find it that telling the stories get us to reach more people. Traditionally, unless you are in front of people who are all in love with politics, obviously you want to talk politics too. But yes, we have a lot of common points between what the Palestinians are going through at this moment and for the past, let's say, 100 years. On the hands of the Zionist movement and propaganda and the imperialist support for their injustice and oppression, is that we do have a lot of things in common with here in the United States, with a lot of people, with a lot of organizations, and all over the world too. So framing the story in a way like that can definitely help all of us move forward to hopefully achieve the liberation of Palestine at the end.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that answer. Brian, Jehad, or Lawrence want to pop in on that one?
Unless Jehad, unless you want to go, I'll add something to that. Yeah, I think thinking about internationalism, I think there's some really concrete ties that can be made. So you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and in 2014, when cops were tear gassing Black protesters in Ferguson, Palestinians were facing the same thing, probably the exact same tear gas canisters that said USA on the side. And Palestinians tweeted to the people of Ferguson tips on how to deal with tear gas. And so, when you talk about the police, you have to talk about the way in which pretty much every U.S. police department has some kind of exchange program with Israeli police forces. The way that the Zionist entity uses its occupation as almost like a product testing site for repressive apparatuses. The border the U.S. shares with Mexico, many of the security systems around there involved surveillance stuff built by Elbit, which is an Israeli company. And so if you're a Central American or Mexican person fleeing the conditions in your country that were imposed by US intervention and imperialism, then you have to go against a security apparatus that was developed in tandem with the US and tested on Palestinian people. So there's very concrete connections in that regard. So I think it's like, is that in many ways oppression put forth by imperialism and capitalism, these big categories are shared. I think in the same way, resistance to oppression is also shared as well. There's a way in which you see people sort of become inspired by people standing up against their oppressors, against neoliberalism, and for democracy. And so, the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring of 2010, 2011, in many ways, began with people in the Arab world standing up against their undemocratic regimes, and it spread. you know, you can see the continuation between that and the Occupy movement that sort of popped up as well. And then in 2019, you saw a second wave of the Arab revolts with governments being toppled in Sudan and Algeria, massive demonstrations in Lebanon and Iraq. And that similarly spread a certain degree of people who face oppression under capitalism, who say, hey, this world is not my own, and I want to fight for something different. And you see the protests spread in Colombia, in Hong Kong, in Haiti, and sort of all these places. So in the ways in which there are different oppressions, which are very different. You know, I face not much oppression compared to sort of other people, but still, I would live better without capitalism existing. It is connected in the same way that our resistances are as well, and can be inspired by them. And so, you know, I think that definitely the recent protests that erupted in the West Bank and in the area of 1948 Palestine, erupting at the same time, I think have a connection with these revolts. We saw 2019 as being a year of global revolt. COVID made that dampen a little bit. I think the U.S. was a exception to that with the rebellion against police this past summer. But now we're looking at, you know, uprisings in Myanmar, in Colombia, and elsewhere. So then there's a way in which people seeing that, hey, we don't live in democracies, we live in capitalist dictatorships of different forms, and we sort of want to rise up against them.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, for sure.
We've been talking about like a connection between labor movements and international solidarity movements. And no one mentioned this, but I do want to bring this up because it's important. Just this last week, a few days ago, the International Longshore Union, the ILWU, if I'm getting that correct, out of Oakland, okay, the longshoremen refused to unload or to deal with, to let dock an Israeli ship that was connected to all the recent horrors in Gaza. So the longshoremen, they refused to handle that ship in a very militant labor solidarity action. That happened right here in Oakland, in the United States, along with the local activists there. They shut down that port for that Israeli ship in a show of strong international militant labor support for Palestine. That should be noted, okay? And also, people like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar are standing up at their great risk, personal and political, have stood up for Palestine in these last few days. I personally, I called Congresswoman's her office in Minneapolis, and I just wanted to talk with one of her staffers and just say, hey, we're with you, Congresswoman Omar. This is important. You know, this is right now where people have got to stand up. This is not just a flavor of the month for the human rights crowd. People are living and dying forever. And the Gaza escalation, you know, it was actually Joe Biden's war, because Joe Biden could have stopped that attack on Gaza from day one. He could have put his foot down and he could have stopped that slaughter, but he let it go on, okay, until the blood was so deep, the international revulsion was so much after Rashida Tlaib, the great congresswoman from Michigan, confronted Biden on that tarmac and said, stop this. What the hell are you doing as the president of America, being involved in these war crimes, these outright war crimes? This is just a butchery and massacres that are going on every day. And then when we saw in May in Gaza, it was just too much. It's too much. And we have to put the pressure on our elected leaders now to do what they need to do. And we have to give our support to our elected leaders like Rashida Tlaib, like Congresswoman Omar, and the rest of the squad and everyone else standing up for Palestine. Mark Pocan, P-O-C-A-N, he is standing up for Palestine. He's a congressman out of central Wisconsin. He's a very strong voice, along with Betty McCollum, Congresswoman Betty McCollum out of Minnesota. Very strong voice for Palestine children, okay? We have got to support these people right now. They have bills pending right now to help the people of Palestine to pull back the US funds from all the horrors that are going on with the military in the occupation now. So, you know, this is not an academic exercise. It's life and blood, you know, it's life and death. And we have to put the pressure, as human rights activists, we have to put the pressure on our elected leaders here in America to dial back the money to Israel. It is so important. Dial back the support. Right now it's happening, and we have to hit that hard.
Thank you for that. Pivoting on or pushing that question forward regarding Ilhan Omar, I wanted to ask folks about that, especially kind of vis-a-vis this, you know, this relationship between supporting the people and recognizing that there is a shift in the Democratic Party on Palestine, like undeniable, but there are like also limits, like really big limits on that, both on what those folks can do and what those folks are actually expressing, right? Like there's big critiques of Sanders and AOC and folks like that, but they also represent at the same time a sea change or whatever in terms of public support among Congress people. Now it's meager in terms of what we would want probably, but I kind of want to ask about this shift to the Democratic Party on Palestine, you know, amid like Rashida Tlaib, Palestinian American, getting elected, and the Squad, right? Like AOC and others supporting Palestine in some contexts, right? Sanders as well. So like, what are the limits of that? And also like, how can, like, I want to kind of push towards thinking about mass movements, right? And like how movements can develop and be supported. And I think people have been gesturing at that with the trade unionism aspect as well as BDS on campus, but I wanted to crack open that kind of eggshell and see what folks thought about it. Yeah, Jehad.
Yes, great question. Brian talked about the Occupy movement and talked about the trajectory of mass movements across the world, and he mentioned the Occupy movement as one example. And I really think that the rise of people like Bernie and Ilhan Omar and Rashida happened thanks to a decade of mobilization since the Occupy movement and before, of course, in American politics. I'm in no way an expert on American politics. I've been a guest in the United States for 7 years. So, but, you know, as an observer, I can say that what distinguishes the rise of people like Bernie, Tlaib, Omar, AOC is a shift in how politics are done, and a shift in the scale and type of engagement of many progressives in the United States, many leftists in the United States who took upon themselves the responsibility of organizing as activists, as members of groups that are trying to organize for economic and racial justice in the US, and also as constituents. So for the first time in a long time in the US, we see this growing interest on the part of a lot of progressives and leftists in supporting candidates like, you know, the Squad and Bernie and others because of their programs and because of their positions. So we are witnessing a moment where we have candidates and politicians and representatives who are making it to the halls of power thanks to support from below. And with them, in terms of how much change they represent domestically in the US in terms of their positions on racial justice, on the police, on all of these issues, they brought with them a change in how Palestine is handled in the broader context of US politics. But again, it's important to remind myself and everyone here is that they can only do that because they know that this is the politics of their base. This is what their electors want. This is the people who went on door knocking. I mean, I myself went door knocking for Bernie in 2016 in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, talking to all sorts of Arab aunties and grandmas about Bernie in Arabic. So, you know, I've briefly been part of this experience, right? So, you know, like, it's important to remind those politicians that they made it to office thanks to support from below, thanks to grassroots organizing that is on the side of Palestinians. And I think it's important to remind them of that and to keep them engaged so that they don't adopt establishment politics and don't fall into the, you know, like, age-old boring narrative around Palestine, Israel that the establishment has adopted for decades and proved useless and boring and, you know, never worked then, won't work now, and will never work in the future. And I think, you know, even if some of them make some mistakes in the way they create their narrative or talk about Palestine, I personally don't think it's malicious. I think, you know, they are faced by a long history of how the traditional institutions has handled the situation and the Palestinian question. And it's on us as constituents and as activists who make people like Bernie's arrival in office and other progressive candidates and politicians make them possible, is to engage them, to hold them accountable, to talk to them, and to be part of the process. Because I think not only on Palestine, but this rise of progressive politics in the US, and, you know, we have candidates who are talking about social and economic justice and, you know, all these and the need for a significant shift in how, you know, issues like racism are handled in the US and so on and so forth. Their power relies on us, because unlike their opponents, they don't have the resources or the capacity to continue talking about these issues. So we have to keep organizing, not just for the sake of Palestine. Of course, Palestine is going to be part of this progressive and leftist and socialist agenda, but also for a whole set of issues that we care about here domestically as well.
Stephen, may I just add one more point that Jehad mentioned, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what I would like to say, I totally agree with you, Jehad, in your assessment. And I do believe also that forming partnerships with other groups here in the United States are becoming very important. For example, forming that relationship with the African American community becomes very important. As Brian mentioned, you know what, like, if you look at what we call our struggle, whether in Palestine or, for example, here in the United States. I mean, what happened a year ago or a little bit more, for example, in Minnesota, is what we see currently happening in Palestine. So forging that relationship and that partnership with those who are suffering and facing the same kind of injustice becomes extremely important for all of us to work on here, especially in the United States.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for that, John. I think Brian wants to add something on this before we go to stacked questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore something that Jehad said and also raise, I think, a warning. I think that we definitely want to build an independent movement that can pressure, you know, politicians. I sat in 2 days ago in my congressperson's office to try to get her to back HR 2590, which is what Lawrence mentioned. And I think that the shift in consciousness of folks like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are really important, and we should celebrate it. And I think that I just want to sort of just elevate one thing that Jehad said, which is also knowing that there is an establishment pull. And so backing these politicians, I think, doesn't mean that we tone back any of the antagonism. It's not like, you know, fuck this person if they don't say this thing right or not. But at the same time, we shouldn't gloss over political political questions. And so I think like it's great if Bernie wants to talk about conditioning aid, and at the same time we should not just say, well, that's great, end, but we should say, hey, like we don't want to condition aid to Israel, we want to end aid to Israel, and we need to sort of have that clear and upfront. Similarly, you know, Ilhan Omar's statement, I think we should defend her to the hilt against the right-wing attacks on her. At the same time, she does the equivocation of violence. You know, she says the unspeakable atrocities of Hamas in the US and Israel, this game that they play on the level of politics that says there's some sort of balance between, you know, a couple rockets that Hamas throws up in the air and the massive bombardment backed by the US that Israel goes down. I think talking about questions like the right to self-defense, the end to this equivocation of it being a violence or a conflict, which other speakers too, is really important. And we do that in the awareness. We should have no illusions that we want to pressure, you know, people in the Democratic Party to do the right thing, but we should be clear, the Democratic Party is a capitalist party. That's not changing tomorrow. We should push our, you know, agenda with sort of whatever, but we still need to build an independent movement that is clear on the political questions, that isn't like antagonistic with people and accepts where stuff is are, but also tries to push beyond that. If we're not trying to push beyond that, I think that we're going to go down that path that Jehad mentioned about going into establishment politics. And I think there's been many movements and political organizations that have made that mistake in the past.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sharing all of those different experiences and for answering questions related to what can we be doing now, putting pressure on, you know, our Congress people and our elected officials. We are now going to go ahead and open up the stack. So if anyone in our audience has any questions or comments, if you are joining us today and you or your family is from Palestine and you would like to share a story with us or have any comments that you would like to make, please type stack in the chat, and we will start going through some questions. Mahmoud Ali, I see you in the stack. You could go ahead.
All right, you guys hear me okay? All right. First of all, I actually wanted to ask this question to John, but also I think Chris would be a good candidate to be part in that. And it's mainly regarding their background as Christian believers. And the reason for that is I see that the support that the Republican Party has towards the Israel and the whole U.S. Support to Israel also related to the Republican support is also related to the Christian belief that a country of Israel, for the Jews has to be made, and for that they are allowing all the issues that's happening there, crimes and anything else. I've had actually discussions with people about this, Republicans or not, and the problem here mainly is, they are actually, even when I try to show them like evidence of what's happening, so many of them, they actually let go of such details because in a way they don't want to feel being supportive of such murders and such crimes. And in that, definitely, they feel, it's dehumanization. They support the dehumanization of Palestinians. But in the same time, they still keep supporting Israel, and they just don't want to face the fact that they are actually participating in such crimes. So, I mean, I just want John and Chris to more elaborate on what's their opinion as, Christian believers on this. I do talk to many people about, John and how much he is supportive of this cause. And, so many of them, they, of course, so many Republicans, when they actually start speaking about this cause, they, of course, think of it as more of a fight between Muslims and Jews. But they forget the fact that this is more of a nation fight, and it's not about religion in this moment here, but it's just the fact that they start speaking out about politics and about that this land belonged to Jews from thousands of years ago. It just really rattles me there. I want people to understand this point from Christian, like people who support this cause. So I really, as a non-Christian, I would understand what this where this reason or the purpose, how those people base their logic on this. Definitely they believe in this, and I've seen honestly so many discussions like it's baseless, about this, and they keep going in circles around and around, and just comes to the point that it's related to their belief, and they just think this is what's going to happen in the end of days. But in the same time, moderate Christian people, I got great friends of mine. They also, they do not support this type of thinking, and they want to to explain more. So I kind of would like John and Chris to elaborate on that, and that should be all. Thank you.
Would you like me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, John. You handle that question.
Okay, that's no problem. First of all, thank you for the question, Mahmoud. When people ask me about my background, the first thing I say, I'm Palestinian. And then second, I say I'm Christian. Palestine for us is not really a religious issue or an issue that we refer to religion in order to tackle this issue. We were raised as Palestinians, whether Christians or Muslims alike, to definitely defend Palestine, to love Palestine, and to basically do everything possible in order to basically put Palestine on the map or on the world's map. That's one thing. Now, in terms of what I call or refer to the Christian Zionism in the United States, they unfortunately have misunderstanding of the Bible. For example, when the term Israel in the Bible is mentioned, they took it, or at least they pretend that it means a piece of land, when in reality for us, Israel is basically means the descendants of Jacob, and all of us are descendants of Jacob somehow. Okay, so it's not a piece of land per se. So basically, when people ask me this question, my answer to them is very simple. The Israeli bullet does not differentiate between Muslim and or Christian. The imprisonment of Palestinians does not differentiate. And as I mentioned before, I was in the Israeli prison 3 times, and I was tortured most probably the same way that a Muslim will be tortured also in the Israeli prison. So there is no difference. The home demolition, the apartheid system that they built throughout the years against Palestinians does not really differentiate between Muslims and Christian. So if you go back to the history of the Palestinian people also, we do have a great leaders among the Palestinian leadership and people also who are Christians, such as George Habash, such as Hanan Ashrawi, such as Bishop Atallah Hanna, such as, and I remember Jehad mentioned Father Manuel also, and so on. So I think the struggle as Palestinians for us is not really what let's put it this way, what the Western media try to portray as more a religious struggle and fight. It's definitely, it's a fight for justice. It's a fight for homeland that was stolen from us by force. And we are fighting every day to get it back. So those are the things that that I think are worth to share with you and with everybody. And I'm really very happy that you asked this question. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I apologize for interrupting here, but it's just, I may not have made it as clear enough, but wanted to ask here. So what the question would be, what would be your answer to a conservative Christian Republican who would tell you that, this is happening, having Israel to be there is actually allowed in Christianity, and that's something that it should be, present, and having those crimes that would be, this is just their way of defending themselves. And we are supporting them. That's the whole reason they are supporting them 100%. And they say that, because I've read it even in some of this verses they bring up, that they say, that God do support the existence of this country, and he will make it back to the Jewish people to have their own land. So this is our, our role to support them as well, because God supports them. So yeah, so it's mainly, how do you answer them as a Christian person?
Chris, do you want to try to answer that, or I don't know if it's me or someone else, but
I can try to answer it because I've had to deal with a lot of some of my own relatives who are also Catholic, unfortunately express quite the same sentiment that Mahmoud's trying to ask us about. And all I have to tell them is that they really need to just reread some of the different proverbs that are said about justice in the Old Testament, and how even taking a look at, coming from someone who has more of just like a basic understanding of the New Testament myself, is that when you're looking at an oppressed people, such as people in Palestine are, especially in Gaza and the West Bank are now, is that in the New Testament, God didn't come to earth as some like high profile king all dressed in gold and like royal garments. He came down as someone who was already a member of those people that were already oppressed, that were already under Roman rule. He was never born of high privilege. He came as someone who was already poor. And I've always tried to, at least to the best of my own ability, throughout my lifetime, seen that God is in those who are most vulnerable, for those who are constantly under the iron fist of some nationalist or fascist regime. And that's how I always try to answer it, is that in terms of being a Catholic Christian, that Catholics around the world need to remember that we've all come from a faith that looks to the poor and the vulnerable as those who are the ones that we need to hold in highest regard to. I don't know if that's like the best explanation I could give, but it looks like I'm frozen. There we go. Okay.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Chris. And I hope maybe that you and Mahmoud can maybe connect together and talk more about that in the future. But we do only have a few more minutes left. So I'm going to let Stephen close us out with one final question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about Christianity, especially because we know how dominant evangelical Christians and how much power they exert in this country, right? So that's it's a material question. So I appreciate that. But I kind of want to close with a question that is based around where we are in part, which is Central Illinois and specifically Bloomington-Normal, which has a couple of college campuses. I go to ISU, I'm a PhD student there. I'm involved in the Graduate Workers Union. And so I guess I want to ask Brian and Jehad and other folks, we have almost no struggle down here. Like there was never a cops off campus movement, right? Like the most radical thing we have is a fossil fuel divestment movement, right? Like that's the most radical thing that we have within ISU's campus. So like, I want to just ask, like, what can we do to kickstart a BDS campaign, right? Or like to bring this together maybe with BLM and an abolition movement of, like that highlights these two things simultaneously. I'm just kind of wanted to ask that out there so we can think about this as we, leave this room and think about it on our own, what we can do down here, like to kickstart a BDS campaign or a Palestinian support. Jehad and Brian.
Yeah, I mean, if it's college-based, there are a lot of resources provided by the National Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the overarching body that helps organize college organizing for Palestine. Definitely get in touch with NSGP. They would really provide all sorts of support. And for those interested on working on divestment campaigns specifically, please reach out to my colleagues at AFSC who lead the Investigate campaign and the Economic Activism campaign. You can find their contact information on the Investigate website, which I already shared. And of course, never underestimate the importance of education, even if the main focus is divestment. It's not possible to lead a divestment effort without cultivating a serious and well-organized educational campaign around that, and the process that leads to, because a lot of people don't know, and a lot of people are willing to help and be part of this movement once they understand what's happening, especially on college campuses, especially people who are part of other struggles and who are interested in learning more about this. So there are a lot of resources, a lot of organizations this time compared to 10 years ago. If we're talking about Palestine organizing in terms of waves, this new phase, which unfortunately, we witness a new phase after every Israeli aggression against Gaza, because the momentum becomes a catalyst for garnering people's efforts and organizing them. So I think now there are much more resources for activists to connect and organize and network and learn from each other. And like I said, as Jehad, who's a Palestinian from Gaza living in the US, I'm willing to help with any educational efforts, but also as Jehad, who works with the American Friends Service Committee, which is an organization that provides, all sorts of support for activists in terms of capacity building when it comes to congressional and all sorts of grassroots advocacy and economic activism and education around Gaza. We're also happy to be in touch with your group and with any other groups or individuals who are interested in doing this work. So please do never hesitate to be in touch, and I'm always here to work with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. If the four of you are open to connecting with people further, I've seen some people dropping websites and things like that in the chat. please feel free to leave your contact information or websites for more information in the chat. Here in Bloomington, Blono DSA is going to keep talking about the issues that we talked about today. So you can email us at blonodsa@gmail.com. Someone can drop that in the chat for me. You can also become a member at dsausa.org/join and become official member of our chapter here in Bloomington-Normal if that's something you're interested in organizing with. We are always open to having everyone join us with that. Again, thank you so much for everyone for being here tonight. This presentation is being recorded, so you can catch it on our social media channels, hopefully within the next few days. We will leave the meeting open for just a couple more minutes for anyone that wants to continue sharing contact information or websites in the chat. But thank you all again so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a great honor.
Thank you, Bloomington DSA. Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
See you
Appreciate
in
it.
the streets.
Yeah, see you in the streets.